Jesse Owens, Young Record Breaker by M. Eboch. Chapters 7 and 8. Chapter 7. 4 years from Friday. At first, Jesse coughed a lot when he ran. He tired quickly, even during short runs. He couldn't imagine why Mr. Riley would go to so much trouble for him. But Jesse didn't want to disappoint his coach, and he still dreamed of being a good runner. Slowly, as the months passed, Jesse's legs got stronger. His lungs got better, too. He went a whole winter without getting pneumonia, that dreaded devil's cold that had almost killed him several times. Mr. Riley's training was just as important as Jesse's hard work. "Don't worry about running fast," Mr. Riley would say. "Just run right. Then the speed will come by itself. Run like you're on a red-hot stove. You don't want your feet to touch it, but they have to. So lift up those feet just as soon as they touch that stove." "But will I ever be fast enough to compete?" Jesse asked, "and maybe even win?" "Just keep training," Mr. Riley said. "But I'm nowhere near as fast as the others," Jesse said. "I'll never make it this year." "Who says we're trying to make it this year?" Mr. Riley said. "Don't just train for Friday's race. Train for 4 years from Friday." That's what he always said. 4 years from Friday. Didn't mean any specific date. It just meant train for the future. Jesse kept working hard, and he got better. He wondered how fast he was. After running the 100-yard dash, Jesse would sometimes ask, "What was my time?" Mr. Riley always said, "Oh, about 13 or 14 seconds. I didn't get it exactly." The best runners ran the 100-yard dash in under 11 seconds. Once, Jesse was sure he'd run especially fast. Mr. Riley was staring at his stopwatch as Jesse stumbled over. Jesse gasped, "Gee, my time must have been better than 13 seconds on that one, Mr. Riley." Mr. Riley gave a small smile. "A little bit. You are improving, but we still have a long way to go. See you tomorrow." On another day, Mr. Riley told Jesse to invite his parents to a school race. Jesse's father was working at a loading dock, but his mother did extra work the day before so she could be there. Jesse ran his best to show her how strong he was getting. He finished the race several steps ahead of the next runner. Mr. Riley took Mrs. Owens aside and told her softly, "Your son has the most unusual pair of 12-year-old legs I've ever seen. This may shock you, but Jesse could become a champion." Mrs. Owens didn't say anything to Jesse. She didn't want to get his hopes up for a thing that sounded so impossible. Still, she gave him an extra tight hug before she left. By the time Jesse finished elementary school, he was one of the fastest runners in his class. He looked forward to racing at Fairmont Junior High School. The track team competed against different schools, and people paid attention to the races. The newspapers even printed the times. Then Jesse had proof that he was getting faster, but he wasn't winning races. He was competing against older boys in longer races, such as the quarter mile. Jesse often got off to a fast start, pulling ahead of the other runners, but he couldn't keep his lead. After about 100 yards, he could hear the others coming up behind him. He tried even harder, but they pulled ahead, and he couldn't catch them again. He didn't think too much about the future. Mr. Riley could talk about 4 years from Friday, but Jesse mostly worried about today. In just a few years, he would have to leave school and get a full-time job like his brothers. Running in races was something to enjoy while he was still a kid. There couldn't be a future in it. Then, one day, the school had a special visitor. A runner named Charlie Paddock gave a speech to the students. Paddock had competed with the University of Southern California. In the early 1920s, Paddock had held every important sprint record. He won the gold medal in the 100-meter dash at the 1920 Olympics in Belgium. 4 years later, he won the silver medal in Paris. The newspapers had called him the world's fastest human. A new world opened for Jesse as he listened. He imagined racing in college. He thought of traveling to other countries to compete. He dreamed of going to the Olympics and maybe even bringing home one of those medals. After the speech, Mr. Riley introduced Jesse to Charlie Paddock. Jesse listened in awe as the two older men talked. Jesse and Paddock looked nothing alike. Paddock was white with a thick, muscular chest. Jesse was young, black, and skinny. But when Paddock left, Jesse said, "I'd like to be like him." Mr. Riley smiled. "You can be a champion like him someday if you work hard enough. But you don't want to run the way he does. He flails his arms and pumps his knees high, and he leaps forward to break the tape at the end. He isn't smooth. You're already smoother than he is. But he wins and I don't. Keep training, Coach Riley said. Remember, 4 years from Friday. The next Olympics is just about 4 years away. For the next meet, Jesse wanted to do his best. This would be the time he won. He glared at his opponents. He wanted to make sure they knew he meant to win. But in race after race, the other runners passed him. Finally, Jesse asked Coach Riley for help. Why do I always fall behind? What am I doing wrong? Mr. Riley smiled. I'm glad you asked. I want you to meet me on Sunday. You don't work Sunday afternoons? No, just in the mornings. Good. I'll pick you up at 1 o'clock. We're going to see the best runners in the whole world. Jesse could hardly wait. Who would they see? Was an Olympic gold medalist visiting Ohio? Jesse went to the library to see a newspaper. He read the sports section, but it didn't say anything about visiting champions. On Sunday afternoon, Jesse got into Mr. Riley's car. He had rarely been in an automobile. It was wonderful to see the scenery flying by, just like back on that train, for mile after mile. They drove for a couple hours. Mr. Riley didn't talk much, but then he never did. Finally, they pulled up at a big building with no roof. Jesse had no idea where they were. Mr. Riley paid the entrance fee, and they went inside. Jesse looked around at the crowd of people. Bleachers stretched to the sides. Ahead, in a wide open ring, horses thundered past. They were at a racetrack. Jesse stared at Mr. Riley. We're here to see horses, not people? Watch the horses run, Mr. Riley said. No man in the world can come close to them. They leaned against a railing and watched the races. Jesse had grown up with farm horses, not race horses. These beautiful animals ran with fluid grace. The winners were the most beautiful of all. Jesse watched them carefully, studying every movement. Coach Riley made soft comments as the horses flew by. Look at the muscles in his neck. See how easy they're resting when he gallops? Finally, they headed home. Back in the car, Mr. Riley asked, Well, what did you see? Jesse bit his lip and wrinkled his forehead in thought. They move like they're not even trying. They make it look easy, but you know they are trying. That's right, Mr. Riley said. And what about their faces? Jesse thought for a moment and then shrugged. I don't know. I didn't see anything on their faces. Coach Riley smiled. That's right. Horses don't try to stare each other down. That's for actors. With a horse, it looks easy. That's because the determination is all on the inside, where no one can see it. Jesse thought about that lesson all the way home. He had been worrying too much about the other runners. He had been putting his energy into his face instead of his legs. He had to forget about the other runners and put his own emotions aside. He would work on being like a racehorse, graceful, fluid, and calm. Jesse put everything he had into training. He was strong enough now to get a job delivering groceries after school. The job paid 20 cents more per hour and also gave Jesse extra exercise. He had a 2-mile walk home after work. He would run 1 block as fast as he could, then walk a block, then run again. His legs got stronger and more muscular. His jumping got better first. In 1928, he made 6 feet in the high jump and 22 feet, 11 3 inches in the broad jump. These were new world records for junior high athletes. Jesse could tell that Coach Riley was proud, but all he said was, keep training. What should I train for next? Why, for 4 weeks from Friday, of course. Charles Riley was like a second father to Jesse. He sometimes brought Jesse home for Sunday supper with his family. He also taught Jesse about more than just running. He said, to win a race, you have to go to your limit and then go past your limit. That's the place victory is always found, because it's victory over yourself. You have a special talent, but a time will come when you'll be asked for more than ability. Then you have to give it everything you have, more than you think you can. You have to make up the difference in manhood. Jesse worked hard in school, but he still couldn't read very well. His grades were never great, but he passed. He had a problem with stuttering, but that didn't keep him from talking. He was friends with everyone. The other students elected him student council leader, something rare for a black student in a mostly white school. The teachers made him a school monitor. Even better than these honors, Coach Riley named him captain of the track team. Jesse felt like he was really somebody. Though Jesse was doing well, times were tough for his family. The Great Depression started in 1929, making work harder to find. The steel mill cut back on its working days, so Jesse's brothers worked only 4 days a week, then 3, then 2. They found whatever jobs they could, moving boxes or hauling trash. Jesse's father, who had grown blind in one eye, stepped in front of a taxi and broke his leg. He spent a long time out of work, and even when his leg healed, he had a difficult time finding a job again. People liked strong young men for physical jobs, and Henry Owens was almost 50 years old and worn out from working in the fields. He had never learned to read or write, so he didn't have many options. Sometimes he got work as a garbage man. The rest of the time he spent looking for jobs. He didn't make as much money as his wife or children. Jesse could see it wasn't easy on him, that for his father, Oakville had been a better place. But he had done the hardest thing. He had left so his children could have a better life. Sylvester had to drop out of school to work. Jesse's mother took in laundry to help pay the rent and keep Jesse from having to drop out too. She was determined that at least one of her children would finish high school. Jesse entered East Technical High School in the fall of 1930. The school was only a few blocks from Jesse's home. Classes weren't too hard. Jesse didn't need to read or study much. The school focused on job skills, such as auto mechanics and welding. The coach, Edgar Wheel, was young and new to the job, and his specialty was football. Coach Wheel asked Charles Riley to help run the track team. Coach Riley gladly became an assistant so he could keep working with Jesse. Jesse's best friend, Dave Alberton, also went to East Technical High School. Dave's specialty was the high jump, and Coach Riley thought he might someday be world class. The boys dreamed about going to the Olympics together someday. One afternoon, Jesse stepped through the school doors to find rain pouring down in a torrent. He paused under the overhang. He didn't mind getting wet, but he didn't want to show up at his job with his clothes dripping. It would look bad, and he didn't want to walk around in cold, sticky clothes for the rest of the day either. A girl came through the doors behind him. Jesse watched as she popped open her umbrella. She was pretty with her hair curled tight against her head. She saw him watching and smiled. She glanced at the rain and said shyly, "Do you want to share my umbrella?" Jesse hardly trusted himself to speak. He nodded, smiled, and stepped forward to take the umbrella from her. He held it as they walked close together, sheltered from the rain. Jesse tried to study the girl from the corner of his eye. She was maybe a couple of years younger than he was. Her clothes were simple, but clean and pretty. She glanced at him and smiled. "My name is Ruth Solomon." "Oh," Jesse stammered. "I'm Jesse Owens. Pleased to meet you." "Which way are you going?" Ruth asked. "To the grocery store, to work. But you don't need to go down there. I'll walk you home." Ruth nodded. "Then you can take the umbrella and bring it back after your job." She smiled, and Jesse felt as if the sun had just started shining. He would get to see this girl at least once more. He searched his brain, trying to think of something else to say to her. He had noticed her southern accent. "Where are you from?" he asked. "Georgia," she said softly. "We haven't been here long. It's nice, though." "I came from Alabama," Jesse said. "Sometimes I miss it, but mostly it's better here. I'm on the track team." Ruth turned her big brown eyes on him. "That's wonderful. Maybe I'll come see you run sometime." Jesse grinned. That evening, after he'd returned her umbrella, Jesse went home and sat on the porch. He stared at the rain and could feel himself smiling. Sylvester came out and punched him on the arm. "What's up with you? Are you sick? I've never seen you sit so still." Jesse looked up at him. "I met this girl." "Oh ho!" Sylvester whooped. He danced around on the porch. "Jesse is in love! Jesse is in love!" Some of Jesse's older brothers and sisters came out to see what was going on. They started teasing Jesse too. He didn't care. It was the truth. He did feel like he loved Ruth Solomon. Maybe someday he would marry her, but he didn't tell Sylvester that. Soon, Jesse was walking Ruth home from school every day before going to his job. Her family was as poor as his, but Ruth always dressed neatly and seemed to see the best in the world. Each time he saw her, Jesse fell a little more in love. About a year after Jesse watched the horse race, he got ready for a big race of his own. The school was competing against other high schools throughout Cleveland. Coach Riley wanted Jesse to run the 220-yard dash. Jesse trained for weeks. He would give it everything he had, even more than he thought he had. The track was circular, and once around it made 220 yards. Jesse got in line with the other runners. He spotted Ruth sitting in the stands and waved to her. Then he crouched, digging his feet into the ground for a solid start. He kept his gaze ahead on where he was going, not on the boys beside him. When the starter's gun went off, Jesse exploded forward. He quickly took the lead. Instead of staying just ahead of the other runners, he pushed himself harder. It was impossible to sprint for a full 220 yards, but Jesse ran as fast as he could. He could feel his lead growing. He came to a curve before the last straightaway. This was where a runner would coast a bit, saving something for the long, tough last stretch. Instead, Jesse pushed as hard as he could. Somehow he would find enough strength later when he needed it. He drove his legs harder. He strained his lungs and heart. He came to the last straightaway. He should have been tired, but he felt like he was running faster than ever. But somehow the other runners were catching up. Jesse could hear their shoes hitting the ground behind him. He reached inside himself for more strength and ran even faster. The 4 other runners drew almost even with him. Jesse pushed himself. He refused to give up. All 4 runners pulled slightly ahead of him. He started to fall behind. "No, I have to catch up," Jesse screamed inside his mind. He was at their heels. One had dropped a half step behind the others. Jesse pulled even with him and then passed him. He was pulling even with the next 2. They crossed the finish line. Jesse felt the tape against his chest, loose and flapping because it had already been broken. He hadn't won. The race was over, but Jesse couldn't stop. He had tried so hard to pass the other boys that he just had to keep running. He ran with all the energy he had straight ahead. He ran until he hit the brick schoolyard wall. Jesse didn't feel any pain from his bruised elbow or aching legs. All the pain came from trying his hardest and losing. He had given everything he had and was still beaten. Jesse wanted to get out of there and be alone, but Coach Riley ran up to him. Jesse waited to hear what he had done wrong. Mr. Riley reached out and shook his hand. "Congratulations, Jesse." Jesse stared. He knew the coach wouldn't make fun of him, but he didn't understand. "I know," Mr. Riley said. "You think you lost today, but you're wrong. You won today. Do you know who you beat? You didn't beat him just once either. You beat him 100 times on that track. Even when the race was over, you kept going. You beat him one more time. You could beat your opponent today, but that doesn't mean you'll beat him tomorrow. It doesn't mean you'll beat him next week or next year." Mr. Riley leaned closer and lowered his voice. Jesse had never heard him talk so much at once. "If you do beat him tomorrow, and next week, and next year, if you keep winning, you'll go to the Olympics someday. But no matter how fast you are, you won't get there unless you can win like you won today. You know who you beat, don't you?" Jesse knew. He had given the race everything he had, at every step, all the way to the end. He had won his own battle. He had beaten himself. Suddenly, the dream that seemed impossible a few minutes ago seemed within reach. Jesse knew that someday he would go to the Olympics. Chapter 8. Successes and Failures. Mr. Riley's lessons and Jesse's hard work started to pay off. One day, Jesse finished the 100-yard dash, feeling like he had wings. He turned back to ask how well he had done. Coach Riley was holding his watch to his ear to make sure it hadn't stopped. Mr. Riley stared at the watch again. Then he got down and measured the track distance to make sure it was really 100 yards. He frowned and measured it a second time. Finally, he went over to Jesse and put a hand on his shoulder. "My boy, you have just done what no other high school athlete has ever done. You have tied the world record." Jesse laughed out loud. "Coach, you always told me I was coming in at 13 seconds or so. Was that true?" Mr. Riley grinned. "Maybe you were a little faster than that, but I didn't want you to get too proud." "Is that why you always had me run long races, ones I couldn't win?" "I wanted you to build up your strength and stamina. It worked, didn't it?" Now that Jesse was entering the shorter races, he started beating older high school boys. His best event was the 100-yard dash. Soon he was winning every time. The only question was how far ahead of the others he would be. Jesse liked winning, but most of all he simply loved the feeling of running. It was a little like flying. Jesse was becoming famous, at least in Cleveland. Sprinters from other schools talked about his style and ability. People came to watch him run. The Cleveland Gazette reported his wins. Jesse also did well in the broad jump and the high jump. In 1932, Jesse got his first shot at the Olympics. Americans were excited because the Games would be in Los Angeles. African Americans were especially interested. It looked like, for the first time, the U.S. team would include many black athletes. Jesse wanted to be one of them. Jesse attended the U.S. Olympic team trials at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. In Cleveland, in high school track meets, Jesse was the star. He usually won far ahead of the competition. The Olympic trials were different. The best athletes came from across the Midwest. Many were older, taller, and stronger than Jesse. "Look at him," Jesse whispered to his friend Dave. "That's Ralph Metcalfe from Marquette University. He's set a lot of sprinting records. He got a silver and a bronze in Los Angeles." Could Jesse really beat someone like that? The college boy seemed so worldly. As Jesse got ready for the first race, Coach Riley put a hand on his shoulder. "Just do your best. Run right, like I taught you." Jesse nodded, though he hardly heard the words. He was thinking, "I have to beat him. I have to win this race." Jesse burst from the starting blocks. He ran hard, straining every muscle. He was neck and neck with Ralph Metcalfe. For a second or two, he was in the lead. But Ralph broke the tape just a moment before Jesse. Jesse's heart felt like it would burst, not from the strain of running, but from disappointment. Still, he offered his hand to Metcalfe. "I thought I had you," Jesse said, gasping for breath. Metcalfe smiled. "Maybe that's what beat you." Jesse didn't make sense of that remark until later. Metcalfe was saying what Coach Riley always said: the mind is just as important as the body. Jesse had run his hardest, but he'd forgotten to relax. He had tightened up and worried about beating the competition rather than just running the best race. He competed in the broad jump and in the 100-meter and 200-meter sprints. He lost all 3 events. On the long trip home, Jesse could hardly bear the pain of disappointment. "I've let everyone down," he said. "I just knew I'd go to the Olympics, and I didn't even make the team. Maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was. Maybe I'll never be good enough." Coach Riley just said, 4 years from next Friday, Jesse. There's another Olympics in 4 years. Metcalfe was one of 18 black athletes who made the final trials for the U.S. team. 4 of them won places on the U.S. Olympic track team. At the Olympics, Metcalfe finished 3rd in the 200-meter race and 2nd in the 100-meter race. Another African American, Eddie Tolan, won the 100-meter. Jesse read about it in the newspapers. He was glad for Ralph Metcalfe, but envious as well. "We should have been there," he told Dave. "Next time," Dave said. "You know what Coach says." The boys grinned at each other and said, together, 4 years from Friday. After the Los Angeles Games, some European athletes stopped in Cleveland on their way home. They held a track meet against some American Olympians and local athletes. Jesse competed. He was able to relax at home without the pressure of the Olympics. He won the 100-meter and the 200-meter sprints. He wasn't competing against the top Olympic sprinters in those races, but still, they were the best from their countries. For the broad jump, he finished 2nd to the Olympic gold medalist. Maybe, Jesse thought, he had a chance after all, in 4 years. Something even more important happened that summer. Jesse became a father. On August 8th, Ruth gave birth to a baby girl whom they named Gloria. Jesse was 18 and Ruth only 16. They hadn't really planned to become parents so young and had to make some difficult decisions. Ruth dropped out of school to work as a hairdresser and take care of the baby. She kept living with her parents while Jesse lived with his. They wanted to be together, but they both felt that Jesse should finish high school and go to college if he had the chance. Then he could provide a better future for all 3 of them and any other children they might have. Jesse enjoyed his final year of high school as president of the student council and captain of the track team. He was popular among the other students. Of the 79 races he ran in high school, he won 75. Crowds would come to see him run. After one indoor meet, the Cleveland Gazette wrote, "Wherever Owens went, Saturday night he commanded attention. When at the far end of the hall, competing in the high jump, he stole the spotlight from the races, and when racing, he was the recipient of cheer after cheer from the extraordinarily large crowd. Jesse finished off the year at the National Interscholastic Championship meet in Chicago. He won the broad jump with a jump of 24 feet, 9 5/8 inches. He tied the record in the 100-yard dash at 9.4 seconds and set a new world record of 20.7 seconds for the 220-yard dash. East Tech won the meet with 54 points. Jesse earned 30 of those points. The team returned to Cleveland tired but happy. Jesse celebrated with his family, then visited Ruth. They stayed up late talking. "Sometimes I can believe it," he told her. "I can believe I really could be a world champion. This could be what I was meant to do." Ruth took his hands. "I believe it. I always did believe in you. Lots of people do. You're a hero to the school, to the city even. This is what you were meant to do. Not just for yourself, but for all of us. You inspire people." Jesse shook his head. "Who would have thought people would even know my name?" The next morning, Sylvester burst into Jesse's room and shook him awake. "Jesse, come on! They're having a parade for you." Jesse yawned and rubbed his eyes. "What are you talking about? What parade?" Sylvester jumped on the bed and sat on top of Jesse. "Don't you hear me? The city is having a parade in your honor. The mayor is going to speak. They're sending cars for us all. Now get up." Jesse laughed. "All right, I will, if you'll get off of me." Sylvester rolled off and headed for the door. "Hey, wait," Jesse called. "What do I wear for a parade? My church clothes?" Sylvester grinned. "No, wear your tracksuit. Let all the girls see your handsome legs." He laughed and ducked out the door as Jesse threw a pillow at him. Jesse hardly had time to wolf down some breakfast before a shiny black convertible with the top down arrived at the door. Jesse sat in the back seat with his mother and father. Sylvester sat in front next to the driver. His other brothers and sisters piled into a second car. As they pulled out, Jesse said, "Wait a minute, we have to get Ruth." He gave directions to the driver, and they swung past Ruth's house. Jesse bounded out of the car and knocked on the door. Ruth stepped out, her eyes wide with amazement. "Jesse, what's happening?" "It's a parade, and you're coming with me." She laughed as he pulled her toward the car. Finally, they met up with the rest of the track team, where the parade would start. Jesse's teammates shared 2 cars. Coach Riley was there, and Coach Wheel. Jesse had the place of honor in the front of the line. He sat up high on the back of the seat so everyone could see him. They drove slowly past crowds of cheering, waving people towards City Hall, where the mayor would give his speech. They cheered for the team, and they cheered Jesse's name. Ruth smiled up at him. "What were you saying last night, Jesse? Who knows your name now?"